those stories, at least there were these repetitive cycles, which started off with thin beds and then passed into these thicker beds. Well, maybe this is at a smaller scale what's happening at this bigger scale. Is that these thin beds, this is why I wanted you guys to sort of look at the thin beds off here on the margin. And when we looked at those thin beds there, we saw that they were somewhat lenticular. And if these were all that made it here, I'd kind of expect at least those beds to be more continuous. But the lenticularity, maybe that's telling us that as we talked about these tails and bodies, that maybe those are the tails of flows. Now, I think the majority of the sand went down at this time. And that's when we did all the deposition and sheets and maybe channelized sheets. But as we continued backing up, maybe when we were depositing this package of sediment here, things actually fluctuated a little bit back and forth. And that the thin beds actually represent tails and the fat beds may represent bodies. And there was clearly a cyclicity. Once again, this is one explanation, and I'll put it out there so you guys can go think about more explanations. So I'd kind of like to know why that does that. I don't know. One simple way is the cyclicity we're seeing here may be basically the stories representing what's happening on the bigger scale. But so many times when we saw those, not every time, a lot of scours are laying over by sands. Having the flows associated with sand scouring doesn't bother me. But we can actually calculate the velocity at which the current is moving when it forms ripples, right? And it's pretty damn slow. We can calculate the velocity of the current that's moving when it deposits silt, even slower. Those flows do not have the capacity to erode, all right? So when we form these mega-fluted surfaces that are overlain by these siltstones and stuff, we know beyond any reasonable doubt that the flow that cut that surface was not the exact same flow that deposited that siltstone. Because we know that's inconsistent. So that's telling us something went by. So when we saw these scours here at the bases of those siltstones, they told us flows went by in advance of that, or that the conditions changed to actually deposit that. So we know that even on a finer scale, there's some it may be pretty insignificant, but there is there's a continued bypass at a finer scale. Then the sandstones, they do a little eroding, but they, for the most part, were pretty passive in nature. And this is something, we published this in a AAPG Hegberg guidebook for the Brushy Canyon back in 2000. And this was Rick Boba with myself and others. And we described these 4 phases for channels. Okay, and other people, Peter's done some of this, I think, even for your 40s work, of describing it. But